Hello and welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to be reviewing Lian Li's latest budget focus case, the Lancool 215, and I'm going to be answering the question, should you go out and get this? And importantly, should you get this over my case of the year for last year, the Lian Li Lancool 2 Mesh? So I think the most striking thing about this case is the two 200mm ARGB fans that come as standard at the front. And similar to the Lancool 2 Mesh, Lian Li have decided to go with an all-mesh front panel with no dust filter. So as well as having great looks, the front panel should bring some excellent airflow into the case. One area where this case outdoes the Lancool 2 Mesh is that the ARGB effects in the front of the case actually extend to the Lian Li logo. As well, in the rear of the case, you'll also find a standard 120mm black fan without any ARGB effects on it, which is great in a budget case because you're not actually going to have to add any extra fans to this case, whether you decide to go with a standard air cooler or an AIO. And with the Lian Li Lancool 2 Mesh, you are going to have to add a rear exhaust fan, so it is going to come at an extra cost. So I managed to pick this case up on pre-order for $61.99, although at the time of filming this review, the price has increased to $79.99, which puts the case within £10 of the Lancool 2 Mesh, which seems quite a strange choice because this particular case has a lot of compromises when it comes to the Lancool 2 Mesh. So I think the first area you're going to have to compromise in is the colour. This case is only available in black, whereas the Lancool 2 Mesh is available in both black and white. So Lian Li have definitely spent most of the budget on this case on the front end, and that is noticeable when you come on to the side panels. Gone are the hinged tempered glass panels on both sides of the Lancool 2 Mesh and the folding down doors over the power supply shroud. In this case, you've got two more traditional side panels, one in tempered glass and one in metal. They're both held on at the back with two captive thumb screws, which once these are loosened, the panels can be slid backwards and lifted away. I did find the panels in this case a little bit tricky to get back on, which was very different to the Lancool 2 Mesh, where the door simply closed and was held closed with a magnetic catch. As I already mentioned, there's no dust filter on the front of the case. It does come with two dust filters. The one at the top is magnetic, while we've got a tray style dust filter at the bottom, which runs the full length of the case. Looking at the front I/O, we've got a power and reset button, combined headphone and microphone jack, and then we've got two USB 3.0 Type A ports. There's also a single LED button which lets you cycle through the various effects on the front ARGB fans. Again, a slight difference to the Lancool 2 Mesh, which had two buttons, one for the steady colours and one for the more dynamic effects. The other absence from the Lancool 2 Mesh is the cutout for the optional USB Type-C cable. So one area you're not going to have to compromise in this case is the amount of hardware you're going to be able to fit in it. So this case will accommodate motherboards up to ATX. We can fit long graphics cards up to a maximum length of 370mm and tall CPU coolers up to a maximum height of 166mm. The case comes with 7 horizontal PCIe expansion slot covers, and importantly you can use the Lancool 2 Mesh vertical GPU kit with this case. We've got a vented panel on top of the power supply shroud, which brings some advantages and disadvantages. The major advantage is it should bring good airflow for the GPU, particularly when you consider the bottom 200mm fan extends down into that power supply area. The major disadvantage is that when you look down at the bottom of the case, if you don't have fans there, it's possible to see the power supply and any cables that are at the bottom of the case. You do of course have the option to mount two 120mm fans on top of the power supply shroud, and Lian Li includes some long screws, making this mounting process straightforward. Another slight difference in this case compared to the Lancool 2 Mesh is that the fans on top of the power supply shroud are mounted directly on top of the perforated panel. In the Lancool 2 Mesh, there's optional cutouts that you can remove if you're mounting fans, so the fans are actually unobstructed in the Lancool 2 Mesh, which would hopefully lead to better airflow and less noise. So as well as being able to mount two 120mm fans above the power supply shroud, we can fit a 120mm fan at the rear of the case. At the top of the case we can either add two 120 or two 140mm fans, while at the front of the case there's room for three 120 or two 140mm fans. although in my opinion it would be an absolute crime to remove the two 200mm fans and replace them with something else. For radiator support, we can fit both a 240 and a 280mm radiator at the top, while you can fit a 240 or 360mm radiator at the front. And one of the nice things about the front mounted radiator option is you can actually mount a radiator and set of fans behind the 200mm fans at the front of the case. You will temporarily need to remove the fans to mount your radiator, but then the fans can be put back in place once the radiator has been secured. And you can fit a radiator and a set of fans up to a combined thickness of 70mm into this compartment. Again, another slight difference between this case and the Lancool 2 Mesh: if you're not planning on using this option with a radiator and fans at the front, there is no optional bracket to cover this space in the case. Moving into the rear of the case, we can see there's cutouts in all the right places, and it's nice to see these do have rubber grommets on them. There's some Velcro straps included for cable management, and as well there's plenty of other cable tie points and cable ties included in the accessory bag. We've also got a combined fan stroke ARGB hub in the rear of the case. This will power up to 6 fans, and there's 6 3-pin connectors on it, and the 3 case fans are already plugged in to this. So while it's great to see a case in this price point coming with a fan hub, one very clear thing that's obviously been omitted is a way to control the speed of the fans. Normally the case would either have a fan speed button, or there'd be an additional cable you plug into one of the fan headers in your motherboard, allowing your motherboard to adjust the speed of the fans, but both of these are lacking in this case. So the big problem with this is the fans are going to run at the same speed, both at idle and under load. At load they may need to run at that faster speed, but at idle they certainly don't. And running at that speed is going to make the PC significantly louder than it needs to be, and I've done a bit of testing on this which I'll share with you later in the video. When it comes to the ARGB part of the hub, you've got 3 ARGB connectors on the hub. Importantly, 2 of them are already occupied with the 2 fans at the front. The third one has a splitter cable on it. One end of the splitter is going to the Lian Li logo at the front of the case, whereas the second end of the splitter ends in a standard 3-pin 5V addressable cable. So you're going to be able to plug an extra accessory into this and control it with the case buttons. We've got another ARGB cable coming from the hub, which is designed to be plugged into a 5V 3-pin addressable ARGB header on your motherboard, allowing your motherboard's ARGB software to control not only the fans at the front, but any additional accessories you plug into that extra connector coming from the ARGB controller. Behind the motherboard, we've got 2 dedicated 2.5-inch mounts, which is 2 less than you'll find in the Lancool 2 Mesh. Another slight difference is you won't have the option to mount 2.5-inch drives in the main compartment of the case on top of the power supply shroud like you did in the Lancool 2 Mesh. Down at the bottom, next to where you're going to mount your power supply, you'll find a hard drive cage. This will accommodate 2 3.5-inch drives, or a single 3.5-inch drive and an additional 2.5-inch drive. Again, the drive cage is of lower quality than found in the Lancool 2 Mesh. There's no option to move it on the sliding rails like you've got in the Lancool 2 Mesh. There's no actual plastic drive trays, and there's no option to use the hot swappable backplate that can be used in the Lancool 2 Mesh. Okay, so that's the main case features. Let's take a look at the build I've put together in the case. The next thing I want to do is have a look at the temperatures, and as you'd expect with the 2 200mm fans at the front and an all mesh panel, the temperatures in this case were excellent. So as you can see with the temperatures up in the screen, the maximum CPU temperature during gaming was 53 degrees C, while the maximum GPU temperature was 63. And during a night of 64 stability test, which is a much more extreme test on the PC, the CPU reached a maximum of 69, while the GPU a maximum of 68. So definitely some very respectable temperatures, although I think it is important to say the Ryzen 5 3600 isn't the most difficult CPU to cool, and we were very aggressive with the cooling approach with a 240mm IO, which is probably more than this CPU needs. So while the temperatures in this case were excellent, the noise levels weren't so good. So at idle, the PC had an average noise level of 41 decibels. This increased to 45 during gaming and 49 during the AIDA64 stability test. And to put things into context, the Quadus PC that I've built so far, at full load during an AIDA64 stability test, reached a maximum noise level of 40 decibels. So this PC, even at idle with nothing happening in the background, was louder than that PC under full load, which is fairly significant. So the next thing I wanted to do was try and work out where the noise levels were coming from. So in my original build, I had replaced the rear stock fan with one that had ARGB on it. It was from AZZA, it was their Digital Hurricane 2 fan. So the first thing I wanted to test was my decision to change that fan out because of the noise. So all I simply did was I put the stock fan back in, plugged it into the same motherboard header, running on the same fan curve. And when I looked at the noise levels at idle, there was absolutely no difference. The noise level was still 41 decibels at idle. So we can say it wasn't the rear fan that was the cause of the noise. So the next thing I wanted to test was the effect of having the fans plugged into the fan hub. And this was where I was putting my money on as the cause of the high idle noise, because to me it didn't make sense to run the fans at one speed all of the time and have no way to adjust them. So in my original build, I left the two fans at the front, the two 200mm fans, plugged into the fan hub. When I was adding in the rear ARGB fan, it had quite a high speed of 1800 revs per minute, and I did have some concerns about plugging that into the fan hub, so I plugged that directly into the motherboard, and that combination gave you the noise levels of 41 decibels at idle. So the first thing I did was I plugged that rear fan into the fan hub. So all three fans in the case were in the fan hub. So changing that rear fan from the motherboard to the fan hub resulted in an additional 5 decibels of noise at idle. So up from 41 to 46 decibels. So the next thing I wanted to look at was having all the fans plugged into the motherboard and having the standard fan curves in the motherboard bias controlling the fans. So this again had a significant reduction to the noise levels. So the noise levels at idle came down to 37 decibels, which was 9 decibels quieter than having all the fans plugged into the fan hub. So from a noise point of view, having all the fans plugged into the fan hub is a terrible idea. But how does it affect the thermals? So what I did, I compared my original configuration where we had the two fans at the front plugged into the fan hub and the rear fan plugged into the motherboard, compared to the one where we had all the fans plugged into the motherboard. So as you'd expect, with the motherboard controlling the fans at idle, the CPU was a little bit hotter by 2 degrees. There was no difference to the GPU temperatures, and having all the fans plugged into the motherboard brought the noise levels down by 4 decibels. The CPU also ran 1 degree hotter under load with the fans plugged into the motherboard, and again, no difference to the GPU temperatures. This again, under load, was associated with 2 decibels of noise saving. So we've got to the bottom of the high noise at idle, and the fan hub is completely to blame. And I cannot recommend using this fan hub under any circumstances. Even if your motherboard doesn't have enough fan headers, get yourself a fan splitter cable, because if you plug fans into this fan hub, your nice looking build is going to drive you mad with noise. So I'm not going to run a whole variety of different configurations in this case, looking at things like putting fans under the GPU, trying an AO at the front instead of at the top, because I've done all that with the Lancool 2 mesh, and this case has a very similar internal layout, and I would expect a lot of these to be the same. So go and have a look at my Lancool 2 mesh thermal test, and I think I tested something like 17 different configurations in that case. So if you're trying to get the answers to those questions, they would be the things I would go and look at. I do want to answer 2 more questions specifically related to this build, and the first relates to the AIO that I use for this build. So I picked this particular AIO based on its looks. I had used it in one previous build, and I did have some issues with noise levels in that build. So I know a lot of you are going to go out and copy my exact build, so I wanted to test the fans on the AIO to see if they were particularly noisy, and maybe should you look at another AIO. So what I did, I replaced the standard fans on the radiator with some obnoxious fans which are optimised for static pressure. So looking at how that affected the temperatures, the CPU and GPU both idled 1 degree hotter, and there was no difference to the temperatures under load. There was a slight saving of noise levels at idle by 1 decibel, but a slightly larger saving in noise levels under load of 3 decibels. So analysing these results, I think this AIO does a great job of keeping the CPU cool, but is probably offering more performance than what you need with this particular CPU. And that excessive performance is coming at a cost of noise. So while I still would recommend this AIO, particularly for its looks and its performance, what I would do is go into the fan curves and bring them down a little bit so the fans aren't spinning up so high. You're still going to get adequate performance, but at much lower noise levels. The next thing I wanted to test was how much cooling performance did you actually lose by going with the stock AMD cooler instead of an AIO. And as I mentioned in my build video, the big reason I went with the AIO was for looks. But importantly, that AIO cost £100, and that £100 could be spent to upgrade the 3060 Ti to a 3070. So there's a massive difference between the cooling performance offered with the AIO and the stock cooler. CPU temperatures were 8 degrees hotter at idle and 13 degrees hotter under an IDA64 stability test using the stock CPU cooler compared to the 240mm AIO. There was no difference to the GPU temperatures at idle, but the GPU ran 3 degrees hotter under load. And the big reason probably for that was having the AIO at the top helped exhaust any of the heat that the GPU was making. Importantly, the only difference with noise levels using the stock cooler was that it was 1 decibel louder at idle, and there was no difference to the levels under load. So while those differences in temperatures on paper seem fairly significant, it's important to note that the IDA64 stability test is a very extreme test, and looking at our previous results, the temperatures under gaming are going to be significantly lower than that. And having the CPU running at those temperatures with the stock cooler on it is not in any way going to affect its performance. So using a stock cooler, yes, your CPU will run slightly hotter, but you're going to get similar performance to somebody who's running an AIO. So I think analysing all that, I think the main benefit your AIO is going to give you is on looks. It is going to give you better CPU temperatures, but that is unlikely to translate to any benefit in performance. So now we've reached the point of the review where I need to tell you, should you go out and buy this case? And when you consider, I think the case looks stunning. It offers some excellent airflow and we got some great temperatures in it. The price I think is reasonable. And as well, I find it a really easy case to build in. For any other case, I would be telling you, go out and get it. But when we consider this is Lian Li's budget version of the Lancool 2 mesh, we're going to have to consider the compromises that Lian Li have made to bring the price down, and whether that price reduction is actually worth it for the features that you're losing. And what's even more important to consider at the moment is that for less than £10 you can upgrade from the Lancool 215 to the Lancool 2 mesh. So before I come on to look at the compromises you're going to have to make, I want to look at some of the potential advantages of this case, because I think this case does have a few potential advantages over the Lancool 2 mesh. I think the first thing is at the moment it's £10 cheaper, but not only that, it actually comes with the right amount of fans that you can run it without having to purchase any extra fans. The Lancool 2 mesh, you are going to have to buy a rear exhaust fan, and you're not going to want to move one of the fans at the front to the back. That would work from an airflow point of view, but from an aesthetic point of view, that would be a terrible decision to make. So you could easily add £5 to the price of the Lancool 2 mesh. So if budget's really important to you, this case does have some advantages. The second potential advantage is the 200mm fans at the front of this case, and that may be an advantage or a disadvantage for you. Some people are going to love them, others are going to hate them. But one thing it does is it makes this case stand out from a lot of the other mesh fronted cases from last year, which included generally 3 120mm ARGB fans at the front. So this case does look a little bit different. The other advantage of the 200mm fans at the front is that they should offer some slightly improved airflow compared to the 3 fans included in the Lancool 2 mesh. So the 200mm fans in the Lancool 215 have an airflow of 98.3 cubic feet per minute, while the fans in the Lancool 2 mesh have an airflow of 49.14 cubic feet per minute. So as this case has 2 fans at the front and the Lancool 2 mesh has 3, and when you multiply the values for this case by 2 and the Lancool 2 mesh by 3, this actually has a higher number, so should offer some slightly improved airflow at the front compared to the Lancool 2 mesh. The other thing to factor in is that the logo at the front of this case, the Lian Li logo, has some ARGB on it. The one in the Lancool 2 mesh doesn't. Another aesthetic difference, which I like slightly better in this case, is the front of the power supply shroud. In the Lancool 2 mesh, one of my biggest criticisms was the perforations they added to the power supply shroud at the front. Particularly when you had ARGB fans on the bottom, this shone light down into the power supply shroud, and actually through the perforations you were able to see your power supply and any of the cables there. I think what they really should have done with that case was have a solid panel at the front and the perforated panel at the back, and that way you had the best of both worlds, good airflow but good aesthetics. So I'm pleased in this case, although the top of the power supply shroud is perforated, it's good to see that the front isn't. So again, that's a slight benefit for this case. So now we come on to the fairly long list of compromises you're going to have to make. And I think the biggest and most striking one is the side panels. On the Lancool 2 mesh, you have the lovely glass hinge doors on both the front and the rear that will swing out and then be held on with magnetic catches. You also had the folding down panels at the front and the back over the power supply shroud, and at the rear you had the nice metal cable covers. The panels in this case were incredibly difficult to put on and off, particularly put on again, and they had fallen off a number of times when I was trying to secure them. Looking at mounting fans on top of the power supply shroud, while they both offer this option, in this case you can't remove the mesh panels like you can in the Lancool 2 mesh, and that again is potentially going to lead to worse airflow and more noise. The other potential issue comes to the little bracket which covered the cutout at the front, which you would use if you weren't going to use a radiator and set of fans at the front. And I think the lack of this bracket is going to mean potentially any cables at the bottom of the case are going to be visible. When it comes to mounting drives, you've got much less options with this case as well. So there's no option to mount drives in the front of this case like you can do in the Lancool 2 mesh. You're going to have less dedicated 2.5-inch drives. You're going to have 2 versus 4. You've got a far inferior hard drive cage. The position can't be moved. You're going to have no plastic drive trays. You're not going to be able to use the hot swappable backplate, and the amount of drives you can mount in the hard drive cage is going to be significantly reduced. Looking at the front I/O, you've got no option to add any USB Type-C cable like you can in the Lancool 2 mesh, and in this case you've only got one button to cycle through the RGB, whereas in the Lancool 2 you've got 2 different buttons, one for the solid colours and one for the more dynamic effects. One of the other really nice features of the Lancool 2 mesh was the removable front radiator bracket, and the fact that it could be adjusted in a variety of positions in 2 different heights and 2 different positions, so that actually in the front, in the furthest position, you could mount fans and radiators up to a maximum thickness of 110mm. The maximum you're going to be able to fit in this case is 70mm. The other slight difference in this case, the Lancool 2 mesh had a multi-position cable cover bar, which hid the cables coming from the back slightly better. This case, although it does have nice cutouts for rubber grommets, it's still not as good as that reversible cable cover bar. Finally, this case has, I think, a poorly thought out fan hub. And the reason I'm putting this down as a negative, because you could of course just decide you're not going to use it, is the people who are new to building a PC and don't realise how the fan hubs work and aren't going to do the testing are going to go ahead and build their PC. They're going to use the fan hub because the feature's there, but then they're going to have an incredibly noisy PC that drives them mad. So I'm actually going to put this inclusion of a fan hub, which is no option to control the fans down, as a negative in this case, and I think actually not including a fan hub at all would have been better. What would have been ideal to have done with what the Lancool 2 Mesh has, have all the 3 fans at the front plugged into a triple fan splitter cable that you can plug directly into your motherboard, and then allow your motherboard to control the fan speeds. So you probably already guessed my conclusion, and that is I can't recommend this case over the Lancool 2 Mesh. I think there's too many compromises, and for the very slightly increased price, you'll get a much better case with the Lancool 2 Mesh, and that would be my recommendation. I think there's only 2 exceptions where I would recommend buying this case over the Lancool 2 Mesh. The first is if you do manage to get it for that cheaper price than I paid for it in pre-order, the $61.99, and you're on a really tight budget and couldn't stretch to the price of the Lancool 2 Mesh. The second would be if you absolutely love the 200mm fans in the front and want something slightly different and are prepared to take the other compromises that the case offers. But for the vast majority of the people, you'll be much better with a Lancool 2 Mesh, and that would be my recommendation. So hopefully you find this video useful and it's helped you make your mind up if you were deciding between the 2 cases. If you have enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up. If you're not subscribed to the channel, please go ahead and click that subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next video.